So welcome back, everybody. I have a very special guest today, and I'm really, really happy for that because we're talking about two wonderful books, and she's the only person on BookTube that has been hyping those books up that I'm aware of. And so I'm really glad to have the Literary Science Alliance here. So welcome, and want to say a few words about yourself and whatnot?
Sure. I'm Angela, Channel Literature Science Alliance. And yeah, I pretty much, Jemisin's my favorite author. I've read every prose work that she has out there now. And I got The World We Make Great on November 1st. I finished it on like November 4th. It was wonderful. So when we were talking about this a couple weeks ago and you're like, do you want to do a talk on it? It's like, okay, yeah, sure. I'm going to make my video for my channel, but yeah, I probably can talk about Jemisin all the time. And unfortunately, whether it's because of like COVID and everything, or because some people just don't like The City We Became as much as The Broken Earth, no one's really talking about it. It doesn't get the hype as like the next big release in this month, The Lost Metal, which is probably out by the time you're posting this or something, that book.
I have no idea when it's going to be out because I'm not reading it. But
I think it's out November 15th in the US, and I think
so
November 17th in the Europe and UK. But
that makes sense. Yeah, I was like, in general, I feel like the last month, like end of October and all of November, is packed with releases, both fantasy and other stuff. There's like the new Cormac McCarthy books coming out, one in October and the other one in December. And there's two Lavi Tidar books, which is one of my favorite authors that no one ever talks about. There's the Jemisin book, and it's like, couldn't you just like space it out over like a year?
I think the answer is capitalism. I think it's because, it's the holiday times, at least in the United States.
Yeah,
we're getting close to Black Friday here, and I'm sure that does something.
True. There's that. And there is obviously like Frankfurt Book Fair, which is one of the biggest book fairs in the world, is always in October. So they, try to do a lot of, especially more in like the literary fiction side of things, to time books with that kind of event, I guess.
Yeah. For the longest time, I've always had a big fantasy release in November, though. Like there's always one big one that drops that month, which is kind of nice because then in December I have the holidays, which I'm sure is not an accident.
I'm pretty sure there's that. Although with other parts, usually you do re-releases in November and December to sell those, especially with music. I know it's like you do re-releases and greatest hits albums in November and December to sell in the holidays, because that's like, if someone has a favorite band, but you don't know if they got the new album, you get them the best of.
Yep, that's the Christmas gift or the whatever holiday.
Exactly that. So yeah, but it's interesting that this one hasn't seen as big of a hype, but well, that's what we're here to change, right?
In our little section of the internet.
Exactly. So I'm going to open a beer for that, and well, cheers.
Nice. What type of beer are you having?
I think this is a wheat beer. Okay. I just dropped by the shop and bought a box of whatever they have. So
I don't drink a lot of beer, but I know a lot about it because my partner like loves craft beers. So like I know his favorites and stuff like that.
I don't know. This is a German Cappuccino Weissbier.
Nice.
Because it was on sale and I'm a cheap bastard. So it's not exactly craft beer, but Germany has not have that much of a craft. It does have a craft beer culture, but not as much, because we have all these small time village breweries anyway that have been around for like 500 years. So we don't have the need to start, brewing against the big companies as much, because
you already have it kind of built in.
Yeah, it's built in. But this is sort of like a mainstream beer already.
Nice.
Yeah. So yeah, you already said that we're excited about it and you loved it. So what's your general like feeling about both The City We Became and The World We Make?
So I do like both of them, but there is a part of me that like, I think a lot of my love for The World We Make The World We Make comes from just, I love reading anything Jemisin gives me. I actually think The City We Became could be better as just a standalone thought. But that said, I didn't dislike my journey through The World We Make, but it was kind of one of those things where I could feel the fatigue Jemisin had on the subject matter a little bit, how close to home it was to her and how exhausting it was to be in the themes she had in the book and in real life. I kind of just like felt that, especially because it's so short. This is less than 400 pages. This is the shortest Jemisin book I've read.
That's true. Yeah. Now that you mention it, yeah, it's like 12 hours and a bit in audio. And,
like we went from a planned trilogy to a duology, and then that second book in the duology is like 100 pages shorter than the first book. Yeah. Which that sometimes happens, but like I think the 5th season's the largest in the Broken Earth trilogy. So I really
Yeah.
enjoyed it, but I do think of the two, The City We Became, I enjoy more, but I give them both 5 stars on my rating scale for those who care about that.
Yeah, I don't do ratings on books.
That's fair. I know it's a whole thing on the internet. And I'm just
It's-
like, for me, it's just nice when I forget everything in like 10 years. I'm like, oh, I liked this enough at this time to give it that number.
Yeah. Now for me, it was more like I've done music reviews for 10 years, and there I had to give ratings. And for me to talk about books and not actually have to assign a number is very liberating in a way. I'm like, yeah, I don't have to.
I think that's important. Like I only rate books for myself, and
Yeah.
it's just for posterity. If I think I was forced to, it would be different.
Yeah. But I do agree that The City We Became could stand as a standalone, almost, because it does kind of end positive, almost positive, with that one unresolved part about Staten Island. We'll definitely go into those parts,
Yeah.
but beyond that, it does do a great job of a lot of things in there. And I was like, how's he going to continue? And then obviously the whole it's no longer a trilogy, and suddenly you're like, okay, that's going to be interesting. And I do agree, and I think that's partly an issue with both The City We Became and The World We Make, in a way, is how close to home they are in a lot of ways. And I think that's sort of where things get interesting with these kind of books is, do we really want to read about these things in our fantasy lives as well? And how close do you actually get? Do you actually drop names, or do you slightly change names? I mean, she obviously goes for slightly changing names and having proud men instead of proud boys and stuff like that. But it is very clear who she's talking about in a lot of ways. And I think that may turn off some people who expect something a little more fantastic, or, less in your face, I guess.
It definitely makes it not an escapist read, although I don't think most people read Jemisin for that quality. Like, at least the most well-known trilogies, the Broken Earth trilogy, no one recommends that being like, this is a happy-go-lucky good time, right? Like, that's not what happens. I mean, there actually are fantasy series by her where I'm like, actually, this is really strong political fantasy, if that's like what you really want. Like, it hits a lot of tropes with the Jemisin flair. But you're right, this is very contemporary. And also, I think in fantasy, sometimes people just don't like contemporary fantasy. Like, some people don't like hearing about things they see every day and then have weird, I'm going to call it magic, although I do think Jemisin in both this and Broken Earth, it's like, sure, it's magic because it's very soft, but also there's a lot of science-y stuff behind it. Like, it has like this sci-fi magic qualities. And then, of course, she brings in Lovecraft elements. And then you got like that cosmic horror element. So I don't know. I really like all of that. And I think for me, even though I'm personally, as someone in the United States, exhausted every single day, like we just had an election and, it's gone better than expected, but I'm sure the entire world is like, what the hell is going on? Why are you guys like this? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know.
I was wondering about like the release, like the publishing timing and the election timing was very close together. I'm like, was that done on purpose? Or
I mean, their tagline was "Vote No to Eldritch Horror." That was like the tagline they were having going around.
Yeah, which is good.
And I mean, I mean, the plot of The World We Make, once you get into it, you realize, oh, this actually is really timely for a November release.
It very much is, with the whole like election campaign in the book and the election campaign outside. I'm like, wow, this is very close.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. Have you ever read Kraken by China Mieville? Because that's like the closest I can, come to like a similar book.
I don't think so. I feel like I've heard of it, but I haven't read it, mainly because I feel like I get nervous about reading sea monster books, and I don't know why. That's a weird part of my personality.
I can assure you that the sea monster actually is a it's a kraken that is actually displayed in a museum, so it's not actually any like living sea monsters that much. It's
just called Kraken. I'm going to look it up on my story graph real quick.
Yeah, it's just Kraken, and it is about the Kraken going missing, the Kraken from the museum being stolen.
Oh, I need to read. So I have to read by this author. He's gotten a resurgence at my bookstore. Suddenly they've been reprinting some of his classics, and I don't know where to start with him. So I need to figure that out.
Well, I guess the number one classic that everyone recommends is Perdido Street Station, which is weird fantasy and urban fantasy in like a fantasy city, but really dark. And then you can go from there. Kraken is a bit more upbeat and funny.
Okay.
But it's also it takes place in London, and it is very much, a lot of pop culture references and references to current politics and stuff
So
like that. But it's a bit more upbeat in a way.
basically what you've been saying about that author, though, it doesn't surprise me that you can compare it to Jemisin, because I have heard like they're both authors who are like, I guess, give me genre boxes and tropes and toolboxes, but I'm also going to like jump across the lines and come back a lot and
Yeah,
work what's best for the story.
and they're both very political authors. I mean, Mieville recently has been doing a lot of nonfiction work. He wrote a sort of like introduction book on the Communist Manifesto this year, and before that he wrote like a nonfiction on the October Revolution. He's a communist.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's a self-declared communist.
Nice.
With party work and everything, so he's very interesting in that regard as well. But I think there's definitely parallels between what Mieville is doing and what Jemisin is doing in a lot of ways, and they always feel like authors that are like part of this newer. It's not necessarily the new weird, but it's younger authors that actually try to change fantasy or science fiction or that whole genre in a way, and maybe move it forward and actually deal with contemporary problems in a way that a lot of fantasy and science fiction, say in the 90s, was not doing. And I think they're very similar in that regard. There's a bunch more of those authors that I feel like are this newer generation that hopefully will shape the face of science fiction and fantasy for the next decade or so.
I mean, she's definitely one of the first mainstream, at least, that's really been pushing it, and I assume similarly with Mieville. But what's interesting is because I've read some backlist SFF works by other authors of color, and I can really see how the previous generations of Black authors who maybe, I mean, Octavia Butler got a resurgence after she passed away, but not in her time per se.
No. Yeah.
And then Nalo Hopkinson is a Caribbean author, and I read Nalo Hopkinson and I'm like, oh, Jemisin read this book and used this narrative device in this book. And
yeah, I think with I haven't read it yet, but I'm really looking forward to reading Black Leopard Red Wolf by Marlon James.
That one's hard. That's a hard read.
Well, I read his last big one, Brief History of Seven Killings, recently, and I absolutely loved it.
I think if you know what you're getting into, you're going to have a wonderful time, because I think it's a very good execution of what his plan is. Yeah. I didn't know what his plan was, so it was difficult for me.
I expect a lot of very explicit violence and stream of consciousness writing.
Yes.
Possibly with Jamaican patois thrown in just to make it hard to understand for me.
I don't know, but because it's actually more based on continental Africa mythology this time. But that doesn't mean I actually caught any of the languages, but it was more continental Africa mythology and folktale.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm just waiting for like the third book to be at least announced, so I avoid the
if it helps, the first book and second book are just the same story in parallel, so you can read the first book as a standalone.
That sounds good. I'm just I try to avoid the usual, I'm waiting for the Doors of Stone kind of problem.
That only happens if the author is very successful, and you know that.
That's true, but Marlon James already won a Booker Prize, so
I mean, with literary authors, you just know it's going to take like 5 times as long as a fantasy author, which takes like twice as long as a romance author. Like, there's just different output times per author genre.
Yeah, that's true. So, but yeah, I'm very much looking forward to that. And I think that's part of where Jemisin did something in a way that Octavia Butler and Nalo Hopkinson didn't really achieve yet, which is drag, say, those racial issues, those ethnic issues, in a way, in fantasy into the mainstream, because Jemisin is skilled enough and good enough that not only fantasy fans read her, but also people on the larger mainstream stage read her and are aware of what she's doing, and that has probably helped to put those things more like front and center in a way. Plus, timing probably also helped with her books, especially with The Broken Earth, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, and it obviously works differently for different readers, but Jemisin isn't subtle about when she's saying something, but I did hear in an interview, it's like she's not actually looking to change people's minds or teach them anything. She's just writing a book, and if you engage with it, interact with it, and it does something with you, that's fine. She's here to tell a story. But she's also not, I think, censoring herself when she's like, but the way the world's working, it's working like this, and I'm basing it off experiences that I see in history. She has a history as like a social worker and stuff, like, and I think the way she does it can, and especially with like this duology, it's like, it's hard stuff, but for me there was a tiny bit of catharsis, and it also was done in a way that didn't make me feel depressed or like I was being preached to and like beaten over the head. It was like obviously there, but I also, for myself and my taste, didn't feel like I was being like preached to on a pulpit or something like that.
I think that's an interesting question that I was asking myself about. Is like, would be interesting to hear your opinions. Like, what's the target audience for this book? Because there is definitely, I mean, there's a lot of great representation of all kinds of different groups in these books, and that's definitely deliberate. It's like, is it for people who want to see themselves in a book, or is it for people who may get like a look at how it may be for less privileged, less white, less heterosexual, less cis people to actually survive in today's contemporary, political climate? Or is it, that's an interesting question for me. Is like, because I did feel that there is a sort of like, that I don't want to say vindication, but it feels like there's a victory there for these people.
Yeah,
and part of that victory is because they are different, and having these different facets to life is very much celebrated in this book.
I do think in particular her choosing, like, so the idea itself, right, of we live in a type of dimension where cities can come to life after a certain amount of culture has been acquired. Interesting. And then you choose to set it in New York City, which is a city she knows. And then she gets to play around and go against every single sitcom that's ever existed in New York City that only shows you like these, 5 to 6 white people with the one black friend in the really nice apartment, like, and gets to show you kind of her thesis of this is my New York, this is who New York is to me, and stuff like that. So I think in some ways that makes it actually less palatable for some people, not necessarily the themes of the work, but how New York City focused it is. At least in the United States, people love to hate New York. They love to dream about New York. Like, New York is, it's not even the politics of it. It's just like a very contentious idea what New York City is.
I think that came across. I mean, that's definitely something that for me is much more distant, because, I know New York is huge and whatnot, but America is far away from me.
Yeah. And like, I mean, I'm sure New York's in a bunch of movies you've seen, but like, I love the idea of cities. I think that's why I love this project specifically by Jemisin, because I love living in cities. I think cities are fascinating conglomerates of culture, and how people find ways to coexist in dense spaces, and what and I think this series is so interested in being like, here's the good, bad, and ugly of cities, and then what is the extra ugly, or what is something that's detrimental? Because it's not like this book saying New York City was already perfect. Cities are actually harmful to the environment, right? And like they talk about that. Like, so I don't know who it's for, other than like it's I think a fascinating project. It works for a lot of my friend group who don't read all the time. Like, they read 4 books a year, and I gave them The City We Became, and they loved it. And one of them is my friend who's a Black woman, and I think she did love seeing a work written by a Black author that wasn't traumatizing the Black characters every 2 seconds.
That might help. There is that one line in The World We Make when Bronca is going to the movies, and she's like, the movie has lesbians in it and they don't die at the end, which is still something to be thankful for. And I'm like, that's part of the thesis of the entire book. It's like, it's about all of these groups and none of them die at the end. And that's unfortunately still rare.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and I do know in an interview for The World We Make, it was a hard process to write, because it was she was writing it during the mayoral campaign in New York City. Yeah. And the way that race ended was depressing to her. So she's like, well, I can write my ending the way I want.
Yeah.
But no, I like I said, that's how I can just like feel the fatigue. Because also something I love about the books, but I think I wish I'd had more of, is we have such well fleshed out characters too. They're not archetypes, they're not caricatures of what they're representing. They have some stereotypes of their boroughs, because that has to be there, but they're really well fleshed out characters. But you don't get a lot of time.
They're archetypes, not stereotypes. There's a small difference, and that's important.
Yeah, but we don't get, like, every time I do get a long chapter with a character, I'm so excited, but I know that like that's one of 2 chapters I'll get with them, like I wish I got more time with all of them. Also, this is Delilah. She's here to say hi.
So yeah, I think one thing that I loved about the characters, I mean, they're well fleshed out, and even the least favorably portrayed character, that being Aislinn from Staten Island, is still handled with dignity, or like tenderness in a way. It's like, And that's something that I appreciated about it. Is like, yes, she has a lot of like really bad ideas, and her worldview is really bad in a lot of ways, but she's still a human, and there's reasons why she is the way she is. And
the rationalization behind why she does what she does is such a human thing of like,
yeah.
well, this person looks like a good person, so how could they not be a good person? They look like it.
Yeah, and that's because that person looks like her. She's white.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important element there, right? Because so much stuff for other people, not for me, works about visuals, right? I mean, it's like you look at people, like they look like me, they're going to be cool. They'll be my kind of people. And when you look at a lot of fantasy, what happens is that most of those characters are still described as very Caucasian white in a lot of ways. And that was
if they're given a description at all, because then a lot of white authors just assume you're going to assume they're white because
that was really fascinating when Steven Erikson talked about it. It's like someone was doing fan art of his characters. Like, I never said those guys are white. In my mind, they're all kinds of colored, but they're not white. So why does everyone draw those guys white?
Yep.
And yeah.
I mean, we're not going to get on tangent of Erikson, but Erikson's world building is like you said, handled with dignity and care in ways that a lot of authors in the early 2000s weren't doing their fantasy work.
Yeah, I think that's something that I feel like Steven Erikson does a great job of. And I recently read, when I was looking about something else, Chana Mieville quote when he was talking about what Tolkien gave to fantasy, which is the power of world building. Because before that, most stuff is actually set on Earth somewhere in the future or in the past or something like the idea of building your own world. And he's like, that's a very radical thing because it gives you a lot of power, and you can create this world the way you want it to be. That reflects back on you as the world builder, but it's also like you can make a better world if you want to by just building it as world building, and so few authors actually go and do that.
Yeah. Or it's like, especially like it can be exhausting because like for me, I get bored sometimes. It's like, okay, another book commentating on feudalism and the faults of it. It's like, I get that we have like 7 million books about feudalism and patriarchy. Give me something else. I guess that's part of what annoyed me. So when I recently read R. Scott Baker, which everyone is loving, and I got like somewhat angry in the discussion we had with Philip Chase and Joanna and Jimmy Nuts and them. And that's exactly the laziness. It's like, oh, this is just like medieval Europe. And also my Ubermensch is very much blonde. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Those were choices you made. Those were choices you made. Yeah. No, I think Jemisin, like when she chooses to create her own worlds versus when she's choosing to write in like a world that's been established, whether it's this or she has her Dreamblood duology, which is based on Egypt in the past.
Yeah.
It's like you can tell where she intentionally tries to make sure she's bringing up some things to the forefront or in what she like leaves behind. And I appreciate the thought and care she puts into it. Like she was talking about the Broken Earth trilogy in a video, and she's like, people might think I'm actually really into rocks, and I am, but I actually know nothing. I just did enough research so I could make the magic make sense.
Yeah. And the rocks and stuff are really cool in the Broken Earth trilogy, but the other elements also make so much sense. And I think that's part of her strength. And I think another part of her strength that once again came to the fore in this duology, right, is Jemisin is great at writing about adult characters. Like when you look at those different, the different avatars of the different parts of the city, at least for me, the ones that like spoke most to me are definitely Brooklyn and Bronca, right? Those
Bronca's my favorite. I would die for Bronca.
She's definitely the best. But like the idea of like grown-up people that have had part of their lives that may have had children, just actually, not just young kids that go on their first adventure kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's
I agree.
skill.
And I mean, in like the diversity of the life experiences of like, the sexual orientations, like the background, like, and the way that it's all handled with a lot of research and care and stuff like that. I don't understand how some people don't like The City We Became, like I said, because they don't get the point. They don't know, because it's not like necessarily a traditional story. And then in some ways it's pretty much a superhero story. Like in many ways, the tropes it's pulling from is like a blockbuster film.
Yeah.
We have to get the team together and save the day, and the team doesn't like each other or know each other. That's Avengers. Like,
yeah, yeah, but it's adventure. It's Avengers, but with marginalized groups doing the avenging, sort of.
Yeah, and like I think some people maybe they didn't connect to the characters, because that's why I love it. Like New York City is a lovely place, but when I go visit it, I just go to Times Square and see musicals because I'm a very basic tourist.
Yeah. I mean,
So
for me, was like I've never been to New York City. I've never been to the States, but I've been to cities in Europe all over the place, and they have different vibes. And you can go to, I don't know, Athens, and go to places in Athens where, like, yeah, the culture changes, and people from this area are very, very different from people from another area, and the whole city still has a very specific vibe that's very different from, say, Rome. If you go to Rome, that's a very different place than Athens in a lot of ways. And London is another place. It's very, very different. And I feel she captures that in a lot of ways. Like, cities are alive. If you go to different cities in different places, you can tell those cities are different. It feels like they have their own atmosphere, their own vibe or character in a way. And those people you meet that personify specific parts of the city. I've met people like that before. I'm like, yeah, you are so much this place.
I already know who would be the avatar of Cleveland, Ohio, if it somehow ever became a city. Like, yeah, it's those type of things. And
yeah,
I loved the interludes where we get to meet other cities.
Yeah.
I thought that was so fun. Istanbul, I didn't know Istanbul loves cats, but now I want to go.
I've never been to Istanbul, but I do believe that's true.
Well, and I loved, there was like a line in that interlude where it's just like,
Yeah.
I love cats. They don't change their religions this time, because, you know, Istanbul has such a rich history.
Yeah, true.
So yeah. No, I just and also I think Jemisin's voice is very unique. It's very voicey, right? When people say that or something, it's like, if you don't like how she writes sentences, or the snark or the sass or the wit, you might get annoyed with it. But like I know in like other series, she always writes things in parentheses all the times and stuff like that. But like, I read the prologue of this book, and I don't actually like the prologue of The City We Became, but I like the prologue of World We Make.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, oh, Neek, I love this. You are such a person. And I think that's part of her character work, is the voice.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is she has established a very unique voice. It's like, you can tell you're reading a Jemisin text, like after, like, I don't know, 2-3 sentences, you're like, this is this character, this is Jemisin. And a lot of authors don't manage to ever really get there, you know, in a lot of ways, to me at least. Like, she definitely has established that very well, very early on.
The first line of the 5th season is one of my favorite first lines in like all of fantasy fiction.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
Just how nonchalant we are about the end of the world. Like, yeah. Most fantasy stories are about preventing the end of the world or something like that, you know?
Yeah, I would say the opening sentence of The Steel Remains by Richard K. Morgan probably still beats it for me, but it's a very close one.
I mean, that's fair. I'm very much like, I always say this all the time on my channel and stuff. Like, I literally would read Jemisin's laundry list, grocery list, whatever. She has a to-do list in her agenda. Yeah. I just like how her brain works and how she translates that to the written word.
Yeah. I still want to read her nonfiction collection. What is it, like, when will there be a Black Future Month?
Oh, the short story collection is How Long Till Black Future Month. Yeah, so it's not nonfiction.
I thought it was mostly essays and stuff, but
No. It has you would be the wrong expectations. Oh, sorry, my cat's food thing's going off. No, it's a short story collection of works she wrote throughout the years in publishing. It does have her foreword that she talks about getting into the industry. Yeah, but they're all short stories. Cool. And actually, that's why I don't love the prologue of The City We Became, because it's a short story in that collection. I think it's tonally very different from the rest of the duology. And I just don't like when authors do that, because I think it's really fun to write new worlds, explore concepts in short stories, if that's your vibe. But I just felt like it was weird, and I didn't like the tonal dissonance. Yeah,
when you connect it to Neek's voice in the next in the prologue of World We Make, then you can see that there's a difference.
Yeah, and like, I also, my blasphemous take is, I don't think Jemisin's as strong as short stories as she is as longer works, because it's not a skill that's, you know, necessarily you're good at one, you're good at the other.
Yeah, they're different skills. She's definitely, I would say she's very good at writing long form in a way.
Yeah, she's one of my favorite. Well, she is my favorite long form author. Yeah,
wouldn't go that far, but I think she's definitely someone I highly respect in a lot of ways, because of, you know, how she approaches topics, how she actually develops characters, how she actually manages to do the form right and do the content right as well. And that's something that not many authors, there's authors I love just for how they put words together. I'm like, I can read this forever and ever, but they're not saying much, but I just love listening to their voice. And then there's authors that maybe don't do the voice that well. And I'm like, that could have been written better, and you could have changed those words and it would have sounded much better, but I appreciate the message. And Jemisin is one of those people where I can see both matching up. And that's something that is unfortunately rare, and I really appreciate it with her.
No, you're exactly right. Like, I'm someone who I think it's challenging for me to focus and read for long periods of time. But with the Jemisin work, like time goes away and I'm just like flipping the pages and like the flow of the syntax works. And then it also has substance. Like there's something that's also there for me to be in, but it's not just the substance. It's the flow of the sentences and the worlds. I get someone's telling me a story and I can't stop.
Yeah, that's true. So let's look a bit more into the books, actually. I think so we already talked about the different avatars and how she's looking at those, and we already established that Bronca is the best one.
We already know who the worst one is too, but
but there might be a difference between like the worst written and or like the one you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true.
I almost feel like actually Manhattan or Manny is the one that I found the hardest to connect to.
I think that's intentional though, right?
I think so, yeah. Because no one really knows what he's like. And say for like, actually, I have a stronger image of Iceland than I have of Manny at that point.
Especially since like, it's interesting because I would say Manny probably, I'd have to look at word count, but I think of all of the boroughs gets the most perspective time between both books. And I think there's a lot of identity problems within himself.
Yeah.
I think I like a good amnesia, fish out of water situation for a character. So he was relatively consistent in what he was doing, but I would agree, like connection with Manny was difficult, especially with what happens in World We Make with his family. That was like a little like, while it was happening, like, okay, this is kind of makes sense, but it's also like out of left field, like what's going on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think one thing that I wanted to look at is the connection with the Eldritch horror, the cosmic horror, whatever you want to call it, the Lovecraftian horror in there, because I think it does something very, very clever. Because the enemy is obviously Lovecraftian, with the city actually being called Relier and everything. That's that's funny. But the interesting thing to me is that when you look at what Lovecraft writes or wrote. We don't need to go into all the racist details, but one thing with Lovecraft's horror is that it's based on things changing, modernity, like things changing being the problem, and things being less wide, like loss of power, and the basic story behind all of it, like even the formation for Relier basically was people being afraid of losing power of their own creations or losing power of the universe in a way. And that's what drives that thing. And then turns into all these attacks on cities and, well, people just being people and no longer just being controlled by the small minority in power, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting. Like, I like a lot of times when marginalized people are taking back, like, how much like Lovecraft is such an influential part of our written culture in horror and sci-fi space, but like kind of taking back some of like the agency there by using it in their stories. I thought it was really interesting how the avatar for this antagonist, they were like, well, we have to make our own city. Like, I thought that was really like that hypocrisy that kind of comes with that. It's like, so you make a city to do this.
Yeah, you're trying to be like those people, but not like those people in a way that's like you can.
And then how like that city could find receptive individuals to help further their cause, and what does it mean to be more receptive? And it's not necessarily like only some people are, like we see at the end of The City We Became, like everyone can get tentacles on them. It's not necessarily that some people are that much worse than others, but the people who don't like change, the people who don't want to lose power, they were the early people who were the forces they could work with.
And I think it's important that she actually, talks about, xenophobia and all these other issues and reduces a lot of that to fear. I mean, it's phobia, right? But to actually make it part of like fear and like what happens is gentrification. You turn everything into like, the same everywhere, because then you don't have to fear anything because you know what you're going to expect. And I think that's part of the strength of the story. It's like, it celebrates, people being different and having the surprising options of all the stuff that's out there instead of just finding the same thing everywhere you go.
No, and that's a big point with Aislinn. I hadn't actually ever made that connection before, but like her big thing is she's so scared.
Yeah.
She's scared of leaving her island. She's scared of what she doesn't know. And like even choosing New York City as the city to focus on for this thought experiment, a lot of people outside of New York City, they fear it. They always hear about crime and everything like that. I mean, that's a big part of World We Make and how Twitter affects it for a second,
Yeah.
And that's a lot of things, is a lot of when you don't know something and you fear it, then suddenly you are more combative against it when you feel it, like there's a threat, right?
Yeah, she does that in World We Make when Aislinn goes to the pizza place, and I think that's sort of the key moment for that particular exploration, right? It's like where we did like testing with focus groups, and we'll make these pizzas taste like pizzas everywhere, so people know what to expect and can't be shocked by those being like actual New York pizzas and not just generic pizzas.
And the fact that it's the California kitchen pizza, which I don't think has made it across seas, but it's pretty mediocre pizza.
I have never fully understood like the differences in American pizza culture.
Well, the quick version is how thick, what's the crust made of, how thick is it, what's its shape, and then there's the sauce, and then there are the toppings, and basically Chicago's deep dish, New York is just huge pizzas you fold. It's there's apparently Connecticut pizza. I'm not convinced, but
that's interesting.
But no, it's I guess we always joke in America that we don't have like our own food identities because, we're such like a melting pot of immigrants and stuff. But I do think pizza and like tacos have been very Americanized in very interesting ways.
Yeah, in a way, I have friends in Rome, and they would definitely disagree with pizza being an American food, but they would also say everything you call pizza over there is not pizza. So yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, like what we call pizza would not be the same.
You have a very specific kind of, I do see that in like actually exploring the whole idea of like fear of the unknown through pizza is a really clever move, because it does actually, get the point across, and it's still very funny.
Yeah, and how like I think just her arc as a character, like, she's not my favorite character because she represents so many people like in my own life, and I'm just like, I just want to shake them, and I just want them to like stop being who they are a little bit. Like,
she's definitely the most painful to read because people like that.
But I like her arc, especially because like she goes through kind of a standard growth redemption arc in this duology, but also it's not quite like a perfect happy ending, right? Like she's not like rid of her xenophobia per se or anything like that.
No. She just sees that maybe there's worse things.
Yeah, but like that's kind of sometimes the only wins you can get. So.
Yeah. I mean, exactly that, and it's made very clear that a lot of that stuff is, the culture she grows up in and the way her father, especially her father, behaves. I feel like that scene that's still in The City We Became, when Aislinn and her mother are talking on the roof and about that whole culture basically making people just, live in fear and unhappiness because that's sort of how things have always been. That was a very powerful scene when her mother's like, I hope you actually make it over to New York.
Yeah, no, I loved that. I felt so bad that like she didn't really have her mother anymore in the World We Make and stuff like that. Because again, everyone was just becoming the same.
Yeah. I did really appreciate that, because that's what I said. Like, even though Aislinn is sort of the bad, not the actual bad guy, but sort of the foil for a lot of stuff, she is still treated with a lot of respect, or not, if not respect, then at least, understanding.
Yeah. It's a really complicated line to go, okay, this is still wrong. This character is still doing bad things. This is not good, but also here's how she is, like giving you reasons to at least contextualize why she's doing what she's doing without going, but that doesn't make it right. Like it's like you can recognize it without being like, but that's, it doesn't make it okay.
Yeah, I think that's a very clever thing she does there, because it kind of reflects the overall political discourse that we have these days, because it's like, who are the people we can still save? Who are the people where there is still like some form of common ground to be found, or some form of like compromise to be found? And who are the people that you can't talk to? Like, the proud men.
Yeah.
Connor, Gavin, whatever, not McInnes he is in this book. Well, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Those people can't be saved. And it doesn't even make sense to try to talk to those people. That's just like that part's over with. And to accept that some people are maybe just beyond dialogue at this point is something that I felt was handled decently here, because there is still a chance for dialogue with Iceland, because she's also trying to, from her situation, she's accepting, overtures when Nezha talks to her and stuff like that. There is still a chance, and we need to take those chances, but we also need to recognize which people are just beyond dialogue.
And also, I think what's important is like they first try to meet with her in the city we became, and she kicks them off the island. And yes, Jersey reaches out and stuff like that. But what was important is that Aislinn also showed up, right? Like we didn't go to her doorstep again. We offered the olive branch, and then there was also being met halfway. And I think that's another part of it, is like getting into the comment section on a Facebook chat when someone's not meeting you halfway is like going to be an exhausting recipe for disaster.
And I mean, they literally, they meet on the ferry, which is literally common ground. I mean, as literally as you can get with that kind of thing.
Yeah. And like, I think it was important to show that it wasn't just that you need to always reach out, but that the other needs to also be willing to come forward.
Yeah, exactly. And if they don't, and I think that's the other part that I enjoyed in a way, or not enjoy, but like appreciated is the better word here, is that it's very, very clear that like, the other boroughs throughout the city we became, they rarely ever think about Staten Island. They're like, yeah, whatever. We're going to do this our way. So it's not like she's just, doing her own thing and hating them from the start. It's also that they think of her last all the time.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where hindsight's 2020. It's like if they knew what was going on and what was at stake, it's like, okay, we have to go to Staten Island first because there are swing vote or something like that, and our whole city coming together.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that's I think that's more just a representation of how New York is, especially when it comes to politics. Like Staten Island is always the island that votes red while everyone else votes blue and stuff like that.
Yeah. One thing that I found, like, I would like to hear your opinion on that one, because I was still like kind of confused, not confused, but like, not sure what I think about is the character of Queens, or Padmini.
Oh, I love Queens, especially how she got to grow in this next book.
Yeah, I do love a lot of that, but I felt like the idea of the Indian, or in this case Bengali girl, being the math genius was like a bit too close to a stereotype for my taste. You know what I mean?
Oh, I guess I saw it as like, well, so Queens is the borough of immigrants and family and hardworking. But also it's the borough where tech industry is always trying to get a foothold. So I guess having a tech character makes sense, one who's strong with that type of background. And then if you're going to have an immigrant, most of the immigrants who can come to the United States usually have to have they usually have to be going into an engineering or analytical field, because that's just like the nature of the beast, I think, with getting those.
Maybe it's just residual damage from stuff like Big Bang
think
Theory.
It's like, it's you're right. It definitely falls into a stereotype, but it's kind of like a systemic one. Like it's like you couldn't come from Bengali to go to school in New York for humanities. Like
no,
like it wouldn't be allowed, which is a horrible thing to say, but that's literally how messed up immigration is.
Well, it wouldn't be allowed, or you can't afford it, because I guess studying humanities in New York in general is something that most people can't afford.
Yeah, and like you have to think long term of like working at a place so you can get the work visa. And I guess I also really liked her inclusion. So I'm born and raised in the United States. I've been a citizen on my mom's half. They've been here from Wales since like the 1600s, but my dad lives in Venezuela, and I don't get to see my Venezuelan family because immigration sucks. So seeing, a nod to immigration troubles and how you can have someone represent a city who's not a citizen, like
that was really strong for me. I like that.
Well, especially like there was this issue that was on the ballot for Ohio that made me rage, because it was like, first of all, it was not an issue that solved a problem. This problem doesn't exist. The problem it's trying to solve was people who are not citizens voting in local elections. Currently, they don't get to vote in local elections. This was just to say extra hard, they are not allowed. And I'm like, but why couldn't someone who lives in your neighborhood, who pays city taxes, care about your school district or something?
See, that's something that we have. Like in Germany, it's like local elections. If you're like registered to, a registered citizen of the town, you're allowed to vote. It doesn't matter what, like, state
Yeah, no, and I
citizenship
think
you have.
it's one of those things where it's like, a nod to community isn't something you can necessarily legalize.
Yeah. Of course not.
Yeah, well, I love her, and she's also really wonderful asexual representation in like really subtle ways.
I did love that. that
just
that
so
was
subtle.
really
it's not harped on, but it's like you read that and you're like, oh yes, she's asexual, and her parents think that she's the type of asexual that doesn't like sex, and it's like, well, yes, but she also still cares about orgasms, and she has her vibrator and she hid it away. Like it was just that's like Jemisin's like terse good character work in like 4 sentences. Like it was
she does that a lot. I mean, she like the trans representation was a bit more overt in this one, I feel, and I understand why, and that was great, but like it reminded me of like the trans representation in A Broken Earth, but it's also just like 1 or 2 sentences, and then you're done. It's like, it's not about that, it's just about the character, it's not front.
You get enough to like not accidentally erase the character experience, because I think that's a problem. It's like, as an author, when you don't have a visual media or anything, you have to still give people enough pieces to know what's on the page, but you also but you don't want to like harp on it and be like, this is all they are, but you don't want to erase them. It's like, it's still important that they are a trans character.
But
I think it was done better in Broken Earth, especially since the one in here wasn't really a character. Like he had one scene in the first book.
And then there's like 1 or 2 random just showing up scenes and
he gets to talk to London on the elevator.
Oh, and he gets the fight scene with the proud men in the village.
Oh yeah.
Where he meets Madison, the girl from the taxi, and they end up dating, right?
I think so. Yeah, no, you're right, and I loved that, and like, oh, that was so good.
I think that scene was so powerful when those fucking Nazis just chase him down the street. They end up in that place and get beaten up by all the people from the village, and I'm like, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, no. So, and like, there are so many moments like that are full of tension that feel really deserved. A lot of stuff that happens with Brooklyn really stressed me out in both books. Like the first book when she loses her brownstones, and the second book where she's fighting for them in the courtroom. That courtroom scene was so stressful to me.
But the ending is so satisfying.
Oh yeah, but you don't know, because Jemisin isn't someone who you're guaranteed like.
No.
You're guaranteed, usually in my experience, a cathartic ending, but you're not usually guaranteed a happy ending.
But I think that's part of what I like about this one, because like, with politics being what they are these days, having a book that does give a lot of positive endings to a lot of marginalized groups is just so satisfying. We are like, that's really cool.
I do think the ending, like, although I like overall I like where it ended up, I thought it was a little like, I thought it was quick how it wrapped up, and I also thought it was like interesting how like all of a sudden, because Queens talked, like they listened. Like it was kind of one of those classic, again, kind of in the superhero genre, so maybe it's in vein with what we've been doing this entire time of like, okay, so just because someone finally like brought up this is dumb, and we're like doing the same thing over and over again without that, we're just going to stop now.
One thing that I really love though is in the first book, I'm sad we didn't get that in the second book, is the scenes in Bronca's culture center, because I've been in like all kinds of left-wing culture centers over my life, and everyone being those people and everyone being constantly fighting against each other, up to the point where they have like one external enemy and then closing ranks and actually fighting for the good again. That felt so real.
Oh yeah, no, that was really good. And also something that I thought was done really well is the creep factor. I don't know, every time there were like the stupid little Eldritch spiders, I freak out.
But I mean, she touches upon on so many of the current like ways certain people that are still very much feared, that's still very much in power and fear like change, are using the system to just keep hold on to power with all those things like the taking away of the brownstones and all of these things were like, holy shit, man.
How
It's
Queens
dark.
just doesn't get to have her job because this one white dude didn't like that his math was corrected.
Exactly. And the sad part is like for me that's interesting because I'm a very white dude to put it mildly. And yeah, I feel it's important for people like me to read that kind of stuff to realize that's not just like a fiction thing that happens in this story to make a point. That's something that happens to a lot of people every fucking day.
Yep.
That shit's real.
Yeah, no, and then like to pair that scene with her like losing connection with Queens, I thought that was a really interesting thing in the world we make, the idea of that connection and a city going to sleep or losing it or something.
Yeah.
Because I think something for me that this is just me as a fantasy reader that I find kind of a stronger consequence than sometimes death. Like I think obviously death can be a pretty big consequence, but loss of power, because power can become part of identity and stuff like that for characters and things like that. Like,
yeah, I think like power or just agency, I think that's like the key thing. And it's something that I personally, struggled with a lot because agency is something that like people with disability like struggle with all the time because there's stuff when you run against the rules of the universe, and then sometimes those are actually rules made by people. You're like, why?
So many times there are rules that are made and I'm like, okay, so this rule is just made to make everyone's life harder. That's what we've decided. Like there's not actually a benefit to this rule other than if people break it, the city gets money.
Yeah. But yeah, that idea of like, loss of agency, and with Queens, that's very strong. And with Brooklyn, slightly less with the whole situation with brownstones. But with Queens, it's very clear that she has so little agency, and all she can do most of the time is trying to just, do so much better than anyone else. So she is just too valuable to lose or just kick off. And that's just like super frightening to be in that situation. And, that's exactly the situation that a lot of immigrants are in.
No, and I do think like, so yeah, there was agency for Queens, but like some of the other problems, like, like you said, Brooklyn, it was less agency, but like loss of home, that's huge, right?
That's huge, yeah.
And especially since she's so Brooklyn.
Yeah. What I liked about Brooklyn was really cool, but what I liked about Bronca was her like being the person that like was fighting all her life basically, and her then trying to be less confrontative and having
trying to keep it inside.
That opposite arc, because usually you have your characters, you have either your young characters trying to become heroes, or you have your old tired warrior or whatever. They are trying to make like an easy life and be peaceful at your Logan Nine Fingers after like the first 3 books of even the first book basically.
I was about to say the first 3 books, okay.
I mean, I feel in Red Country it's even more on the nose. But you have those characters. Your tired warrior tries to not do, and then the world's dragging him back in. But to actually see someone who's like, I've been fighting all my life, but now I need to actually, be nice to people for once, and not do like the reflex thing, and actually getting away with it and not being dragged back into the world of fighting. That was really powerful for me.
Yeah, well, and like she had me nervous in the first book when she really didn't want to like be involved at all, but that was kind of all of them. They were all the reluctant heroes.
Yeah, because they were so focused on their specific borough, which I guess is, and that's part, I guess, of especially municipal politics, right? It's like the people on top, they try to play all the other ones against each other. It's like, yeah, Brooklyn doesn't like Bronx and so forth. That's built into, that's how you keep the system running. And it's like, once they actually band together, they're so much more powerful.
Yeah, there's just I think the way, like we've already kind of talked about, but Jemisin, like this was a fun story. I think it's just a fun blockbuster story, like on its face value. But you can also just get so much more out of it, and it's done in a very fulfilling yet economical way. Like these 2 books all together is like what, 800 pages?
Yeah.
Okay, what's the shortest Malazan book? I don't even know.
The shortest Malazan book is, well,
it's gotta be Gardens of the Moon, right? But
Gardens
I think the word count would still be greater.
Of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, that one's the shortest, and that's Audiobook is 26 hours. The audiobooks for these together are 28 hours. So the shortest Malazan book might be shorter. I
Might
think
be.
it's around 600 pages.
I say this
together.
as someone who actually still really likes Gardens of the Moon. It's just, you know.
No, this one
like
is so fast,
people
fast
do on a
paced.
first read.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of like what you said, like the superhero kind of action blockbuster thing. It's very fast paced. A lot of stuff happens very quickly.
Something I think that I liked the City of We Became More than this one, just from a structural perspective, is that one is more like hits the ground running and you never stop for those 4 days. And this has time jumps, and that's fine. But sometimes when second books do that, I'm like, fine, but I want to see what's in that time jump. Why don't we just write it? And I get why they don't. This happened with the Greenbone Saga as well and stuff like that. Like it's not a Jemisin unique thing. It's like
no,
it happens all the time.
But I guess I guess the problem that you have with like a second book in a trilogy or a second book in a duology or whatever is that you can't really surprise the reader with like all the fun new stuff because they kind of know the world already. So it's easy to just like say, I'll do a time jump because I expect my readers to already know the characters and stuff. And the first book is always like, hey, I've made up this great new world. Let me show you all about it.
Yeah, like because chapter 1 or 2, we're on the FDR bridge fighting a monster on a cab. Like,
yeah,
the first scenes are so cinematic.
They really are, and they're so much fun. And I did like the Portuguese speaking guy that Manny meets in the first book, that he got like a comeback when Manny is leaving the city and shows up again, and they're talking about all of that stuff. The plumber.
Yeah. I think he's Puerto Rican.
Might be Puerto Rican.
I thought he was Puerto Rican. You're getting the Sao Paulo and Jersey. Those are our Portuguese speakers.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, he's Puerto Rican.
Yeah. Because I remember, like, I distinctly remember, because we don't actually have a Latina character, and well, okay, we do. Jersey counts because that's part of Latin America. We don't have a Spanish-speaking character in our cast.
True. Yeah.
And Manny kind of like represents all mixed people, kind of, right?
Yeah.
And like that was like the first moment where it's like, oh, he thinks I look like his son, but I'm not Puerto Rican. Like,
yeah.
Or he goes, I think I'm not.
Which is a great thing to say. Like, I think I'm not. Yeah.
Oh, sorry if you're hearing my other big cat running through right now. He wants his food.
No, that yeah, that's true. You don't have like a straight up Latina character in there.
Which, like, I don't think, I mean, obviously with only this many boroughs, you can't represent everyone. And I don't think you should have just tokenized and picked every single perfect thing. Like,
yeah, and having and it's not really clear if Branca is all just native or all kinds of other things mixed in as well. You know, it's kind of hinted that there is all kinds of other stuff there as well, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, yeah, I as someone who is Latin American, it would have been cool. And like, obviously there are strong Dominican and Puerto Rican communities, but like they also, like, at least the Puerto Ricans, they got West Side Story at least. So like, for better or worse, nice sad story about gentrification in Manhattan.
There you go.
Gentrification is also really always interesting to read about, especially as someone who is a transplant to a city that's always constantly gentrifying itself. Like figuring out in what ways you're complicit in your like living somewhere.
I think that's she actually managed to make that partly like clear how that why it is so seductive in a way, because you know, it's if you're living there, the first steps of gentrification are they're kind of nice, right? Suddenly you have all these cool things around you. It's so much easier. It eases stuff, and like
suddenly you can't pay your rent because the rent hikes up, and
and then that's the problem. That's when you're fucked. But the first, you know, your first Starbucks around the corner is something you're like, yeah, that's not that bad.
Well, I think like so living in Boston, I've loved living here. I've lived here for a decade now. I'm not going to stay here, but for 2 years though, I lived in a section that basically has gotten taken over by student housing. So people who go to college, so they like spend 1 or 2 years in an apartment or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think I never minded when I lived with neighbors that blasted music in the middle of the night or had kids or whatever. Like were loud. Like that was always fine. Like that was good city noise. But when I was suddenly next to students who were blasting music or talking late or partying, it was bad city noise. And part of it is I'm just an old lady who hates everything. But another part of me is like, they don't respect the fact that they're a part of a community. And it's so obvious that they don't care about anyone around them because they're so temporary. Whereas
Yeah.
where I lived before was it was more rooted down, and there was like a difference to the noise there.
Yeah. Well, I've played bagpipes at 3 a.m. I feel called out now.
Well, I mean, there's a part like in this book brings it up. It's like when you live in a city, you
Yeah.
cannot expect perfection or silence or anything like that. That's not a part
Yeah.
of living in a dense area. But there's a different quality and
Mm.
respect to people who care about each other in the community versus people
Yeah.
who are
Yeah.
transient.
Yeah, I think that's important, and it's important that she does make that very clear. Mostly about noise. It's very much about music and the drum circles and all the people like blasting music and stuff. It's very much about like how that is sort of defining the culture. It's very much about noise, because that's the thing people complain about the first, like, oh, like your music is so loud. Like,
Yeah, and I think that's like an interesting thing because a lot of people who hear about cities and don't live in them, they want to have the perks of living in a city without like the obvious side effects of living in a city. Like you're going
yeah,
to live in an apartment, you're going to have neighbors, there's
yeah,
going to be loud public transit. Like
yeah,
it's not a suburb.
yeah,
So I don't know. I thought that really contextualized something that because I just was trying to figure out why I was so much angrier in the new neighborhood versus the old one, even though it wasn't necessarily a difference in volume, but it was the quality of the noise. I don't know.
yeah. It's the disregard, I guess.
Yeah.
And the disregard for just like, or the lack of community. It's like, we're not in this together. It's like, I make noise tonight and you don't complain, but you make noise tomorrow, I won't complain.
Yeah, like there are like there's unspoken
Mm?
things when you're in something for the long haul versus when you're
Yeah,
just like a 21-year-old who wants to party and you don't even realize how much your rent is because you're lucky enough to like have someone pay for it.
yeah,
And that's I think what also sucked because it's not like my rent was cheap there. My rent was very expensive to live near these very annoying people.
yeah. I can see how that is annoying. But yeah,
So
but I did like the general idea that so much of this book is very much about like, community. And what actually solves it all, solves it all at the end is like, community and respecting both the differences and the commonalities, and saying like, what, things can actually, be cool if you just accept that we're in this for the long haul. And I think that's what kind of ended up with the end, right? With Manny staying and not moving away. It's like, yeah, you're in this for the long haul. And then we get like that teaser of that like sex scene.
Jemisin always does that to me. I actually think her relationship building is really well done. It's really subtle. It's never like the front, but I never get it as much as I want.
Yeah.
There's a short story in the collection that's
Yeah.
like kind of a spy espionage Regency romance thing. And I'm like, can you just write me a Regency romance? Like, can we just write genre romance, Jemisin, just for one book? I don't think she has any intention of doing that, but
No,
like one of my favorite adult relationships is in The Shadowed Sun, which is the second book in the Dreamblood duology. And I think that's the thing. They're adult relationships which come with different failings in communication. Like people always complain about miscommunication in YA and stuff like that. But it's like adults still miscommunicate and still aren't very good at things.
To be fair, I do kind of like the relationship later on in book 2 and mostly book 3 of Broken Earth as well.
No, I like that one too. That one didn't feel as romantic to me, I guess,
No.
but it was a very well-crafted relationship.
Yeah, it wasn't very romantic. It was more like this, we've both been through a lot of stuff, so let's...
Yeah, it was a very like, yeah, this is probably what would have happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think she's really good at
romantic,
realizing.
I guess. It's more relationship than romance. Yeah. No, I just started, I reread City We Became before I read
Me too.
And I just read all of it in like 4 days, all of it, and that was just like so much fun. I think that's sort of what I liked about it, is like, beyond anything else, and the politics, which I agree with, and all that stuff, and all the anger that I was like, yeah, and all the satisfying stuff when people that I really don't like get their comeuppance and all of that stuff. Beyond that, what I really liked was just the joy that you can feel from it. You read the book, it's like you can feel Jemisin does have a deep love for New York, with all its problems and all its oddities, and there's that that just love of just like dropping all those Easter eggs and all those fun references and stuff, just going wild with it from time to time. I was like, you know what? I can do both at the same time. I can do fun and still tell you also about like how
like
bad
the
it
city
is.
we became with the Starbucks is attacking. That's just silly.
That was so
That's
funny.
Great. Well, and I'm jealous because it sounds like you got to listen to the audiobooks and I haven't gotten to, and I just know Robin Miles puts out all the stops on these audiobooks.
These two, holy shit. I mean, she's great in Broken Earth, but she's even better in this one. That's just, I do have a sort of, it's a very specific thing. They are audiobooks, but they also have some, sound effects and stuff in it.
Yeah, I've heard about that. And like I saw a trailer for it and like I just couldn't get my hands on them. But when I reread it, I'm going to. I wanted to reread City We Became with the audio because I love Robin Miles. Like I love her voice so much.
I feel Robin Miles as a narrator is the perfect matching to N.K. Jemisin in a way that, people say that James Marsters is the perfect voice for the Dresden Files, and what's his name? Stephen Pacey is the perfect voice for First Law and stuff like that. And Robin Miles does give a very specific voice to N.K. Jemisin that just works really well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's also great is, especially specifically for Broken Earth, and I assume this happens in the duology as well. When I read, I don't necessarily give anyone accents. I'm not very good at that. I can't even do accents in real life. Like if anyone's ever like, give me your British accent, I'm like, no, it's not happening. Like, it's not a thing. Whereas, so there's a lot of accents in the Broken Earth trilogy I never even noticed because I just didn't process that while I was consuming the story. But when Robin Miles does it, I'm like, oh, this really adds a layer to the world building that I wasn't doing for myself.
Yeah, I feel she does a great job there. I feel it's somewhat more. I mean, she does it great, so I'm not complaining. But it's like you have someone doing sort of ethnic accents of people they're not a part of that can go wrong really easily, right?
Yes.
That might just be part of why I sometimes felt slightly uncomfortable with Queens because
Yeah, I could see that.
That one is probably the stereotypical Indian, Bengali, whatever accent kind of. Yeah. No.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
That combined
that makes
with
more
the
sense why you would have that stronger connection of are we overly stereotyping this? Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe.
But I mean, I think sound is a really powerful thing.
Oh yeah.
Well, like we were talking about like transgender identity. I've gotten really good at not like gendering someone off visuals, but I'm really bad with audio. I will still like hear a voice and it'll be categorized as femme or masc, which I'm still trying to undo in my brain's wiring. But
I think it's very difficult. It's very difficult to do that.
Yeah. So, but like I get like some people cry when they read. No. I cry when I hear music. Like music is very emotional for me.
Yeah. Well, I've cried listening to audiobooks.
Well, yeah. All right. Any other things on your notes that we haven't, like, we definitely only scratched the surface, but like, I could probably talk about these books for like longer than the audiobooks.
Which are not that long. No, I think we're good for that. But yeah, I could continue talking about all of that. But that's I think is the strength of these, that they connect to so many other things that are part of our, everyday existence and life. And it's like, yeah, we can talk about these characters and then we can talk about this thing, and it goes down in this rabbit hole that is all about that very specific experience of that part of our daily existence.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's great to hear that you really enjoyed it, because like I don't actually get to hear from many like European people what they feel about it, because it's a very Americanized work. I guess like a lot of media can be like that, but like this more than anything, it's like this is about New York City, probably the most American city that we have.
I would say maybe for me it was actually easier to connect to it in a way, because I'm not affected by those local politics, and people that are very deeply into that could probably get like a.
It's definitely like it's a little, it can be stressful. Well, and like I don't think we've talked about it here, but like the reason why the second book didn't happen, because it was supposed to be about a president attacking their home city when they run for president and then win, which happened.
Yeah.
Like that happened. So we don't have a plot of a fiction book anymore. We have a weird nonfiction magical realism if she writes that book. Like,
yeah, see, that's like part of like when history kind of overtakes you. There was an interesting thing with William Gibson, whom I love, the author of Neuromancer, and like one of the key figures of cyberpunk.
Yep.
And he wrote his first like last trilogy or like last series. He starts with the Peripheral, which is now, I guess, a show that I haven't seen. And the second book of that one, in the timeline, Hillary Clinton is president, and he had written the entire thing, and I was like, shit. Like he was almost finished with the book in like late 2016, and then suddenly he's like, damn.
Well, and that definitely happened here when Jemisin does interviews. She's like, when I first wrote the first book, that New York doesn't even exist anymore. And I think that's part of what's depressing for her, is like the city she loves and that you can feel in the city that became. Its ugliness has come more forward, I guess, the underbelly of it all.
Yeah, I can see that. I think it shows in the world we make when we have the problem with the NYPD. I feel that one was very personal.
Yeah, a lot of it feels really personal, but it does feel like, like you said, there is still a victory in it. Like there is still more hope than sadness in it. I think I even had not seen the interview. It's like I did feel okay, you wanted to give us an ending because you, as an author, respect us as readers and you felt like you wanted to do that, and you had it in you to do it because obviously authors don't owe us anything. But also your heart was not as in this as much as the first one because of world circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. There's way more heart in the first one, when it's like, wow, you can feel the love for New York City in that one.
Yeah, no, the first, and that's kind of why, like, I love both of them, and I'm like just a Jemisin stan. I'll just read words that she puts out, but like, but if like someone read the first book and was like, I only liked it, should I read the second one? It's like, you're probably fine. You can read whatever you want. Like,
you should still do it, but I know what you mean.
Well, I mean, that's what I say all the time, right? But like, I try not to be one of those booktubers who's like, you must read these things, mainly because then people get angry when they don't like a book. And it's like, well, you're an adult. Most of the time, people who watch me are adults.
Yeah.
Make decisions.
I've given up on that, because mostly I talk about books that I don't have a lot to criticize, and people are like, should I still read this? And like, I just told you why it's racist. It's up to you, man.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, I think sometimes it can be interesting to read a work that is problematic, just to have an example of when to notice it when you're reading less bad versions, but also just be better at reading critically. Like,
especially when it comes to older texts, I feel like it's important to read those because they have shaped the genre that we're reading right now, and it's important to know where that stuff comes from in a way.
Yeah.
And
no, for sure.
Yeah, that's a very specific approach to reading fantasy. It's like, I'm reading this even though I get angry.
I only can do it once in a while. Like my big, like we've talked about, my big, I'm reading this even though I don't love it, has been Wheel of Time for the past 3 years. And then I'll move on to something else.
Yeah, I just like forced myself to read it in like 4 months, and then I was done.
I don't think I could finish it if I tried to do that. I think that I would have rage quit.
I think the daily vlogs helped me, because I could just like rage in the afternoon for like half an hour on all the stuff I went through in the morning.
It helps me because I'm like reading it with a friend, so at least there's like a book clubbiness of it,
Yeah.
But what's been fun is like I've had the same ish experience with like a real low point at some of the books, but it's been like relatively like a 2.5 to 3 experience for me. Whereas my friend like had great experience, and then she's been hating it, and now we're finally getting back up again. I'm like, see, when you have the same bad expectations the entire time.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, let's wrap this up. And once again, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of course.
Next time Jemisin puts something out, we can gush over it again.
Gosh, I hope. Well, who knows when that'll even happen? But I'm excited for it.
Exactly.
I'm just gonna start rereading the Inheritance trilogy, though. It's been 2 years, so that's the next plan.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I haven't read that in. Like I first heard Jemisin on an interview on the Sword and Laser podcast when the first one just came out.
Wow. Like, so 2010. Wow.
That was somewhere around 2010. Yeah, that's when, and she was doing an interview with a podcast back then. She was asked a lot of stuff like, how do you feel about like being a black fantasy writer and stuff like that. And it was just like really early days for her. And
well, and publishing in 2010, I mean, that was a different time.
Yeah. So I think I might be due a reread of Inheritance as well.
No, and especially now, like that's a trilogy where it's like it's unique because you don't like, you're not prepared for a trilogy that doesn't have connected plots.
Yeah.
Which is like, it's just like a different project. And so now that I like know the project of it, haven't read it, it's like, okay, I'm excited to like go in knowing what's happening.
Yeah. Well,
I just like rereading a lot.
There's science out there that says that actually knowing what you're reading will actually increase your enjoyment, which is like the whole, like, you know, spoilers actually might just help you read the book.
It is a weird thing where I realize that I like things more when I do know what's going to happen or I'm rereading it or something, but like I still avoid spoilers and I don't know why. It's a weird thing. I won't ever figure it out. I'm being surrounded by my cats. They're very excited that the kitten's not out right now because I've been kitten sitting.
I guess then I'll leave you with your cats and until the kittens come out.
Yeah, I'm gonna let the kitten out for a bit and they're gonna be angry at me again. But
we'll do that. And once again, thank you, and I'll